Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's towards the end of the day. You've heard before a lot about Syrian Jewish history, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Just know that the Syrian Jewish community had been in Syria for over 3,000 years, and that after 1492, they absorbed Spanish Jews from the expulsion. They also added Italian Jews, Francos, people like Hillel Picciotto, who had come from Livorno and previously had visited Aleppo. And so you've got a lot of history there and a long history of Jews living there. There was emigration over several periods, Ottoman rule for many centuries. You know about the dhimmi status, we talked about that. And the late 19th century, the economy declines and people move to England, to Egypt. The Ottoman Empire collapses in 1907 and 1908, which is the end of dhimmi status, and army conscription begins, so they start to emigrate wholesale. When I was writing my book, branching out from Sephardi, I knew about the emigration of my own grandparents who had come in 1907 and 1908, and then after World War I in 1920 and 21. But I realized that this period, up until the airlift in 1992, was an enigma to me, and I didn't really know it or understand it until I started to research for my book. And as I was researching, I had also, in my daily life in the Syrian Jewish community, I had met people who I found had come before 1992. Well, how did they come before 1992 if the airlift wasn't until 92? And so I started to wonder about that. And then I remembered that when I was a teenager and I was dating in the 1970s, I had a boyfriend, a guy I was dating, and he would periodically go off for weeks at a time to Lebanon. And at that time, Lebanon, Beirut was a hot city. It was, very modern. A lot of people liked it there. And, but then he would come back, and I'd say, well, what did you do there? Well, I had business. Well, what kind of business? And I came to understand later that he was helping to smuggle people out of Syria. And it took me a long time to understand it. And I gradually came as a journalist to collect first-person accounts of people who had left before the 1992 airlift. So what happens, we know in 1948, Israel becomes a state. And in 1947, there are anti-Jewish riots in Aleppo, and there are attacks against the Jews. And in December, when the United Nations votes in favor of a partition, there's a lot of unrest. And it's not just Syria, it's all over the Middle East, it's in North Africa, and lots of people are murdered. This is a photo, actually, of the courtyard in the great synagogue of Aleppo. You see the chains that are hanging across. Those chains were used to hang memorial lamps, which are very common in Arab countries. By the next day, well-off families were fleeing, and by the mid-1950s, there were only 10,000 Jews left in Aleppo. Of the 10,000, only 2,000 remained, and mostly those were people who really just couldn't afford to leave. They became prisoners of the Sephardic Syrian regime, the secret services, the Mubarak, and their passwords were stamped in red with the word Musawi, and so that their movements could be more easily restricted. The travel between the cities was forbidden, except by special permission. Many university faculties were closed to Jews. Once Israel was created, the Jews in the surrounding Muslim countries were endangered, and we've had various numbers today of how many people moved from the Muslim countries out of the Muslim countries, how many Jews were displaced. But the persecution in Syria was common because they were no longer permitted to own property, travel, or do their own occupation. And anti-Semitism was government sanctioned. Those Jews who were permitted to travel for business could not travel with family members because the government feared that they would flee. and businesses and educational opportunities became limited. Those who tried to escape were caught, tortured, and killed. Synagogues were burned. The government feared that Jewish men would join the forces with Israel and fight against them in the army. Syrians wishing to travel abroad had to leave at least one family member behind and to post bond to ensure their return. There were reports of serious oppression in Syria against the remaining Jews in the 1960s. The Muslim Islamic Congress met, and they declared that Jews should be treated as aggressive combatants. And in 1970, they were completely banned from leaving at all. People were smuggled out. That's that guy I was dating. Many tried to bribe their way out of the country. So what I did was I went into the JDC archives, the Joint Distribution Committee, and I found a lot of information that had been previously held confidential, but a lot of information that really gave me insight into this particular period. This is a story that I collected from someone. I've changed his name. But in 1971, Maurice paid a smuggler to get him out of Aleppo. That same year, Damascus-born Michael stole the passport of a Muslim, switched his picture, and walked across the border into Turkey. He was one of the lucky ones. This is his quote. As a Jew growing up in Aleppo in the 50s and 60s, I endured every imaginable type of persecution, religious, social, professional, and personal. I endured the humiliation of a 10 p.m. curfew and rejection from public events. I was compelled to look at a pests not allowed sign, which included a caricature of a hook-nosed Jew hanging outside Aleppo's famed citadel. I had my Jewish glasses torn from my face. I had my head bashed against the wall time and again. Worst of all, I was geographically penned in like a circus animal in a physical ring of land 6 kilometers wide, a physical boundary I could not violate. My wishes were simple: to walk freely through the streets, to carry an ID that didn't bear a red stamp, a religious badge, much like Eastern Europeans' Judean Yellow Star of David, to taste Coca-Cola, and to learn history from uncensored textbooks. I longed for the freedoms that I imagined others took for granted, the ones I heard about on Voice of America, my radio access to that other world across the sea. I dreamed of using the university degree I worked so hard to earn. One day, I said, one day, I shall not be denied the same employments that my Muslim and Christian counterparts so easily secured. So when I went to the JDC, I found that there were a lot of confidential reports that I was now allowed to see about their work in Syria and their work supporting Jews in many Middle Eastern countries. The Jews were primarily in Kamlishi, Damascus, and Aleppo, and there were reports about really severe persecution. We know about the bars from employment, real estate transactions, and attending universities, the Musawi in big red letters. At one point, the JDC was sending the equivalent of $120,000 a year to provide food and other essential needs to the communities. It was also reported that the lack of employment was forcing adolescent girls into prostitution and to consider marriage to Arabic. So these are some of the letters. They're really hard for you to read, so I'm just going to pick out little pieces. But this was a letter to the JDC. It was in 1958. A very disturbing report which had been received from abroad about the situation of the remaining 7,200 Jews in Syria since the declaration of the United Arab Republic. It goes on to talk about threatened massacres, the Jews living in fear, not able to leave their houses at night, and the Jews in Syria believe that the government will adopt the same policy toward them as Egypt did toward its Jews. And then it talks about the Middle East desk in the State Department. it is thought that it may be possible for the State Department to obtain Syrian visas for someone to go to Egypt. So they go on, and these reports go on for pages and pages. This is another one. Some Jewish girls working for a tailor told the employer they would stay home for a number of days. Their intention was to cross the border to Lebanon and escape. The lenders of the community brought the story to the attention of the police. The girls were caught near the border, put in prison, and are jailed. This was a letter in 1963. The Jews of Syria are asked the JDC to support a mass emigration. They want an airlift. They want to get out. Okay? The JDC reported that 628 Jews were able to leave in 1962, and they reported that it was actually cheaper for them to smuggle them than to bribe people to get them out. And it was costing somewhere legally between $1,500 and $3,000 a person. There were a lot of organizations involved in this smuggling, the Red Cross, ORT, the Jewish Agency, B'nai B'rith, HIAS, and World Jewish Congress, as well as the JDC. Here's another one. This is about restrictions in September 63. Jews are barred from employment in official or assimilated services. This has been brought about by the commercial and industrial organizations to avoid giving them employment. The unemployed people were thus compelled to go away by all means to earn their bread out of Syria. It should be noted that had there been able in the various Syrian administrations, but they were given notice because they were Jews. Syrian Jews are prohibited to make deeds concerning commercial and financial transactions. The Syrian Jews are unable to obtain identity cards and a certificate of registration. So these reports go on and on. The JTA reports, this is October 1963, Syrian Jews are subjected to severe persecutions. A number were arrested last week while trying to flee across the Syrian-Turkish border to escape persecution and discrimination. A tourist whose name was withheld and whose religion was not known was brought back with him a detailed eyewitness report on the suffering of Syria's Jews. These reports go on and on and on. We have heard reports that Jews living in Damascus indicated they are being persecuted and more recently are being deprived of their livelihoods. This is Rabbi Moses Cohen, and he writes it in a letter in March 1964, and the JDC, and also, just to point out, he's saying, is there any truth to this information? What is being done? Why isn't this more public? And the JDC responds that the Anglo-Jewish newspapers do not carry stories on this because publicity would make it worse for the people living there. Isaac Shalom, who was a very big leader in the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, was very, very active in helping the JDC and in advocating for the communities in Syria to get money from the JDC. And there are many, many, many letters from him, from Rabbi Jacob Kasson, who was then the chief rabbi there, to the JDC asking for funds. And the letters indicate funds for food, funds for religious items, funds for education, basic survival. A JDC report on Kamlishi in October 1964. Recent shakeups in the regime, the power struggle swirling around General Hafiz has put a crimp in the way of the realization of our scheme to get Jews out of Kamlishi as well as out of the rest of Syria. And again, like these go on. And then we know the story of Ellie Cohen, who was an Egyptian-born spy of Aleppan descent who was able to infiltrate into the government in Syria and was a spy releasing information to Israel. And of course, we know that he was caught and he was murdered in 1965 in the public square. That's a picture of his hanging. In 1974, the Post reported that there were bodies of 12 young Jews were found, and they were mutilated when they stepped on a minefield trying to escape Kamlishi. And the ADL of B'nai B'rith reported that 4 of them were women, 3 of them sisters who had been brutally raped. I think we heard from a young man today from Yeshiva of Flatbush who talked about the 3 sisters. This is the 3 sisters. In 1975, on 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace reported Israel's toughest enemies and interviews with Syrian Jews. And he said that he went into Syria and he said that they were subject to special surveillance, but there were no restrictions. After the story broadcast, CBS was heavily criticized for that story and that it did not paint an accurate picture of how bad the Jewish situation was in Syria. So the American Jewish Congress called the program inaccurate and distorted. CBS had to go back in and re-air an episode and return for a follow-up story. In 1977, and I remember this very vividly as a young bride myself, they allowed 12 girls to come from Syria as brides, promised brides to men in the Brooklyn Syrian community. There were no brides. There were no grooms. I mean, they were promised to grooms, but they didn't marry those people. They were housed in New York, in Brooklyn. They were taken in. My husband's uncle had one of them in his home, and they did eventually marry in the community. During the 10-year period in the 1980s, holy objects were smuggled out of Syria through the efforts of Rabbi Hamra. The collection included 9 ancient Bible manuscripts known as Ketarim, each between 700 and 900 years old. There were 40 Torah scrolls, and there were decorative boxes. And the collection was sent via Turkey in stages to the Jewish National and University Library at Hebrew University. The smuggling was necessary because official requests for permission to take the items out of Syria had been denied. In 1990, the ADL of B'nai B'rith reported Salim and Eli Swed, both Damascus pharmacists, were imprisoned awaiting trial. They had been in jail incommunicado for more than 2 years, had not formally charged with a crime, and were denied legal counsel. 7 others were arrested at the same time. Judy Feld Carr is a Canadian musicologist and mother. She single-handedly rescued 3,200 Syrian Jews, getting them smuggled out of the country. She literally bought their lives. She did fundraising efforts at synagogues in Canada, and on Shabbat Zakur, which is right before Purim, they highlighted in all the synagogues, they highlighted the plight of the Syrian Jews to raise money. In 91, the Council for the Rescue of Syrian Jews is formed. The issue had really been ignored by mainline press and Jewish organizations for many, many years. And then there was a lot of bribery, and when ransoms could not be negotiated, escapes were planned. Finally, after years of oppression, there was a major lobbying effort among federal election officials to free the remaining Jews in Syria. In 92, Assad opened the doors to immigration for a short window. He would not let them go to Israel. There was a major airlift of about 5,000 Syrian Jews. Negotiations between Bush with heavy lobbying from Jewish Americans of Syrian descent and Syria's President Assad resulted in Syrian Jews receiving exit visas to the US as tourists. It took a while to untangle the mess for the tourists. These are the agencies that were involved. There were also some national American agencies, but these are the agencies that were involved with the JDC and the Jewish Agency as leads. So what happens, So what happens is that these Syrian Jews are brought to America, and just to describe the airlift as I remember it in my community, every week, every day, there would be 2 to 3 plane loads of people coming from Syria, and people going, and buses. And all of those immigrants had to be absorbed in a very, very short period of time. Over 700 kids placed in the yeshiva system. homes had to be found, jobs had to be found. A lot of the people coming out of Syria were professionals. They had professional licenses as doctors and lawyers. But what it does is you have to understand that if the first immigrants were coming in 1907 and before and after World War I, already I'm second generation America. By 1992, you don't see the Arabic that you did in the early part of the 20th century. So what happens is as the new wave comes, you see this resurgence of Judeo-Arabic culture in the community, the use of Arabic, which had been lost by the fourth generation. And the new immigrants, they eventually find jobs and are integrated into society. What I found interesting was, I still go back to what happened to those guys that had come in the 70s and the 80s that I had met and collected stories from as a journalist. And what I found was they were refugees. They had escaped. They had literally escaped or bribed someone to get across the border. My book, Branching Out from Sephardi, I have a few here with me. It's also on Amazon, and my cookbook. And if you have questions, that's my email. Thank you.